Hello there, I'm Channing Dutton, and you have found the 3 Degree Podcast. This is Valentine's Day 2025, and we have a really interesting guest with so many things to say that are important for people who have love in their heart on this Valentine's Day. And that's Dr. Jennifer Francis, who will be talking to us extensively about the Arctic and the ocean.
Yeah, and I've known Dr. Francis for quite some time, fellow meteorologist. She works at the Woodwell Climate Research Center, which is very close to my full-time employer, Woods Hole Group, just the other part of the Cape. And she has done amazing research, and most recently has looked at what the ice-free Arctic means when it comes to storms in the mid-latitudes, or where most of us live that are you're listening and watching. So, Dr. Francis, thanks for joining us. Channing, you want to start us off with the first question?
Yeah, if I can. As the person who knows you the least, and as the lawyer in the crowd, I'm going to probably ask the most elemental questions. But years ago, I saw a TED Talk with Dr. James Hansen talking about, I think his quote was, "All hell is going to break loose in the North Atlantic as we continue to warm." And could you just take the ball right off the bat and talk to us about this issue of coming storms, what we are likely to see that maybe we haven't really seen or appreciated yet?
Sure. Well, that's a big question. There's a lot of factors connected to climate change that are going to influence storms in particular, but all kinds of weather. So droughts, floods, heat waves, but just storms in particular. Probably what comes to mind for people thinking about the North Atlantic would be influences on hurricanes, tropical storms, things like that. And we know that there's a very clear connection between the warming globe, which in turn warms the oceans. And we know right now the North Atlantic is warmer than it's been in a very long time. It's several degrees warmer than it should be, breaking all kinds of records the last couple of years. And that heat in the ocean is a big deal because storms really feed off of that. That's where they get most of their energy, is from that heat that then increases the evaporation of moisture into the atmosphere. And that moisture in the atmosphere then condenses into clouds and releases heat into the air. And that's really what fuels both tropical storms and also, to a great extent, the other kinds of storms that we experience, say, in the wintertime, or thunderstorms and tornadoes. And all of those things really are feeding off of that energy that comes from the moisture that evaporates from oceans. And that evaporation is much larger now because those oceans are much warmer, not just the Atlantic, but also in the Pacific in a lot of regions. So that's one really important aspect. But we also have a much more kind of complicated connection to climate change, which is really the topic of my research, and that is how climate change is affecting what we call the jet stream, which is this river of very fast-moving winds that's up at altitudes where jets fly. And you've seen it on TV weather maps as it looks like a river going across the United States with these north and south undulations. And so one of the things we think is happening is that, especially as the Arctic has been warming so fast, and it's warming 3 to 4 times faster than the globe as a whole, because that Arctic is warming so fast, it's having an influence on the jet stream that is causing these big undulations north and south to occur more often. And the reason that's important is because it's those big undulations that really create the high pressure and low pressure areas that you would see on a TV weather map. And it makes them sometimes become much more sluggish. And so we tend to see the weather conditions at any given location stick around a lot longer. And you can think about, what's going on right now across the United States, where we've had this very persistent cold, which is kind of a change from the last few years. But in the middle of the country, that cold has been sticking around for a long time. And it's partly because we've got one of these big dips in the jet stream that's just kind of stuck in place.
From one sailor to another, it's really nice to have you on the program. something we talked about in a previous program, and I know you're kind of a specialist in, and I think you were just describing, is something called Arctic amplification. Could you just talk about that just a little bit in connection to kind of in follow up to what you previously talked about?
Sure. Yeah, so this term Arctic amplification, I like to call it amplified Arctic warming, because it's really the warming of the Arctic that we're most focused on right now, because the Arctic actually goes both ways. When the Earth is cooling, as it has in the past, the Arctic tends to cool more than the globe as a whole. So it goes in both directions. It warms more than the globe, and it also cools more than the globe. And so this concept of Arctic amplification really just means that the Arctic is more sensitive. And so it experiences bigger cooling and warming. But what we're seeing right now overwhelmingly is the warming side of this. And the main reason it's happening is because of what we call positive feedbacks, or vicious cycles that happen in the climate system. So the easiest one to explain is the one involving sea ice, where sea ice is the frozen surface of the Arctic Ocean. The Arctic is an ocean surrounded by land. And normally that Arctic Ocean is mostly filled with this frozen ice, this frozen sea ice. And as we warm the globe, that ice starts to melt, because the Arctic Ocean is very close to the freezing point. So it doesn't take a lot of warming to melt some ice. Then as soon as you start melting the ice, it exposes the underlying ocean, which is much darker than the ice, obviously. So the ice reflects most of the sun's energy that hits it, whereas the underlying ocean absorbs almost all of the sun's energy that hits it. So as we lose some ice, we're absorbing more of the sun's heat. That warms that water, melts more ice, and this sets up this vicious cycle. So this is the main reason why we're seeing the Arctic warm so much faster than the rest of the globe. And people often ask, well, why isn't the Antarctic warming fast too? There's a lot of ice there. Well, the sea ice around the Antarctic continent, remember Antarctica is a continent and not an ocean, the sea ice down there every summer melts back to the coastline as a normal thing. And so there's really no opportunity for this vicious cycle to set up, because the ice is already melting back to the coast, and then it can't melt anymore because there's no more ice. There's just a couple spots where there's ice that lasts over the summer. So you really don't have this mechanism there to set up this positive feedback or vicious cycle that leads to the extra warming that happens in the Arctic.
The ice that is up there, and you alluded to this in Antarctica, what's surrounding the continent, but I think we're still seeing similar trends in the Arctic region. The difference between multi-year ice and new ice, and I think a lot of climate dismissives like to point out maps that show aerial coverage of sea ice in the Arctic is unchanged, or not as significantly changed as one might expect. But can you talk about why the multi-year ice and the lack of it is significant?
Yeah, so just to define those two kinds of ice a little more distinctly. So every winter, it gets cold, obviously, up in the Arctic. It's dark for 6 months of the year, and the surface of the ocean freezes. So that creates what we call first-year ice. If that ice is able to survive through the following summer, when a lot of the Arctic Ocean's ice melts, then it becomes multi-year ice. And that ice tends to be much thicker. And every year it exists up there, it gets thicker and thicker and thicker. So it used to be, back in only 40 years ago, that the Arctic Ocean contained a good fraction of this multi-year ice. Sort of 2/3 of the ice up there used to be what we'd call multi-year. And the other ice would be this first-year ice that would tend to melt out in the summertime. But now we have very little multi-year ice left. Most of it has disappeared. And all we have left now is what forms during the winter. It's much thinner. It's much more fragile. It's much more easy to move around with winds. And so it's much easier to melt that ice. And so just in the last 40 years, we've seen in the summertime a reduction in the area covered by the sea ice of about half. So about half of the ice that we would normally see in September, which is the end of the period when the melting happens, half of it's gone. And if you also take into account the thickness of that ice and you multiply it times the area, you get the volume of the ice. So it's much thinner now as well. So the volume has decreased by about 3/4. This is an incredibly huge change in the climate system. That sea ice is a huge factor in really creating a refrigerant for the Earth because of its being so white. It reflects a lot of the sun's energy. So as we lose so much of this ice, the Earth is literally darker now. And that's a big reason why the warming is happening faster and faster. We think that it might even be accelerating. And a lot of it is because we're losing this bright white surface. Not just the sea ice, but also the spring snow cover is disappearing as fast as the sea ice is disappearing.
That's the whole topic is so sobering, and I want to at least help our viewers understand your willingness to participate in the show today. And so could you explain to our viewers where you are right now? And as you explain that, as you have been adventuring in your zone of the world, what have you observed about the ocean or the behavior of the ocean that maybe people in predominantly Midwest Iowa that maybe we're not thinking about because it is cold here, just like you were talking about?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so let me just give a little backstory. Like David, I've been a big sailor my whole life. My husband and I have been very fortunate to do a lot of sailing. We sailed around the globe back in the early 80s for 5 years. We took off for a year with our kids and sort of gave them a taste of the sailing life. And now my husband and I spend 8 months of the year living on a sailboat. And we're still working. We're still, it's just living on a sailboat, but doing life, all the things that we do in life. So over the last 8 years that we've been living on our sailboat for most of the year at a time, we started in New England and made our way through the Caribbean and up the west coast of Central America through and out to French Polynesia, which is, basically where Tahiti is. It's south of the equator and very far out into the ocean. So typically it takes about 3 weeks to sail from Mexico to get to Tahiti. That's how far it is. So we've seen a lot of changes as we've sailed through the oceans over the years, and as I've learned more and more about the climate system and weather and so forth. And when you're living in it, you're experiencing weather. So weather varies hugely from one day to the next. So I wouldn't say that I could definitely point to things in the weather that I've been able to say this is a sign of climate change, but what we have seen is a lot of impacts of sea level rise. So I remember very vividly when we were sailing through a group of islands on the Caribbean side of Panama, which are just these very low-lying islands made out of sand called the San Blas Islands. We had very up-to-date charts showing us where these islands were, where the shallows were, and more than once, several times, there were islands on our chart that were no longer there in real life. They were instead shoals or shallow water because sea level rise had basically eroded them away. And all of the islands that we've seen, almost everywhere, we've seen a lot of erosion happening along beaches, places where there were hotels that you could see pictures of what their beach used to look like, and now it's just a pile of rocks with trees falling into the ocean. That has been a very vivid example of climate change. But, and the coral reefs in a lot of the tropical places we've been, the coral is in terrible condition. Even way out here in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, a lot of it is dead. And it's really sad. We've been back to places that we visited back in the 80s when we were sailing, and really looked forward to the beautiful snorkeling that we did there, and we get there and it's completely dead. So that's been a really disturbing aspect of climate change that we've observed with our very own eyes.
Wow, that's an incredible story. And it reminds me of the connections back to the Arctic, because there's so many indigenous communities up in the far north. I think most Americans forget that we're an Arctic nation, and they don't really know that there are indigenous communities that are part of the United States way in the far north. And they're also very vulnerable to sea level rise and erosion and storm surges and all these things. Could you describe how these changes in the Arctic, the warming and predictability of animals arriving at certain times or not arriving, is creating a situation of food insecurity for so many people in these far northern areas?
Yeah, those people living in the Arctic are experiencing a whole spectrum of huge changes that affect their traditional ways of life, that is destroying the infrastructure of their villages through things like erosion and sea level rise, and by the ice retreating away from the coastlines, that allows waves to become bigger if a storm comes along. And so those waves create a lot of extra erosion. So there's so many ways that they're being affected in just profound ways. And so just talking about, their food specifically, by losing that sea ice, it's really changing the entire marine food web that they depend on. The types of fish are not the same anymore. They're seeing a lot more subarctic species moving into places where they're used to finding Arctic species. And just their whole method of getting out onto the ice to hunt for some of these fish and whales and seals and the things that they depend on for their traditional food sources has become very difficult, because that ice either is gone or it's so thin now that it's very dangerous. They would normally take, they could go out on the ice and be quite secure out there, but now it's too dangerous, and so they just can't do it that way. I think the land-based animals are also struggling. Because we're seeing a lot more, of course, the warmer temperatures mean that in some areas, instead of snow falling, they're getting a lot more rain events. And when rain falls on top of snow, it creates a very thick crust. And that has been a real problem for reindeer specifically, because they are not able to dig down through the snow and find the lichen and the plants that they would normally eat. And so the reindeer have been suffering as well, which of course affects the people who depend on those. So, I mean, it's the myriad of change that's rippling through the physical climate system up there and the biological system, that both of which affect the people up there. It's a real challenge for a lot of communities up there right now.
Dr. Francis, since this is largely a Midwest audience, can you talk a little bit about the spectrum of work that you and your colleagues do at Woodwell? You talk a lot about the Arctic, and I know that there's a lot of studies going on with permafrost, but there's looking at the economic impacts of climate change. Can you talk about the wide variety of things that you're researching there and your colleagues are researching at Woodwell?
Yeah, so we have some really wonderful scientists at Woodwell, and we're mostly focused on land changes in the climate system. That includes rivers, it includes coastlines, it includes policy, and it includes risk posed by climate change. So some of the biggest projects that we're working on as a center, as you mentioned, permafrost. I'm not sure your listeners might not know what permafrost is, but it's soil up in the high Arctic that is frozen. So, but it contains a lot of organic matter in addition to the actual soil itself. So a lot of dead plants, a lot of dead bugs, a lot of dead animals that have been frozen in this soil for thousands of years. But because of that rapid warming in the Arctic now, we're seeing that permafrost thawing and becoming much less extensive than it used to be. And this is a big deal for a bunch of reasons. One of them goes back to the previous question. which is making it much more difficult for the communities up there to both travel, because normally they'd be going across this frozen surface and that would support their vehicles. But it also means that their community, their buildings and their roads are crumbling as the soil underneath starts to thaw. And also probably the biggest factor that is affecting us all with respect to this loss of permafrost is that as permafrost thaws, because it contains all that organic matter, it then starts to decompose. It would be like taking a pound of frozen hamburger out of your freezer and then forgetting about it on your kitchen counter for a week in the summer. So, it starts to decompose, and all of those organic components in there start to break down. And when they break down, they release either carbon dioxide or methane into the atmosphere. Both of those are greenhouse gases. And so there's a lot more greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere because of that permafrost thaw. But other things at Woodwell, we have a big group working on rivers and how the rivers are changing, wetlands around the coastlines and also inland. We have a huge group working on climate risk. So working with businesses and how to help those businesses see the risks that are posed to their assets, say different facilities in different parts of the world that they may own, helping their investors make better decisions based on the risk posed by climate change. We have a huge tropics group that is studying the Amazon tropical forest, the tropical forest in the Congo, and how those are really being diminished because of the deforestation and then the resulting exacerbated drought and flooding that happens. So we've got a real active group. Another group is working with farmers to help manage their soils better when they plant crops, so that they don't release as much various greenhouse gases, and also do a better job growing those crops. And another group working with rangeland farmers, so better practices to have their animals grazing on land to also, again, sequester more carbon and release less of it into the atmosphere. So we have a very broad spectrum of activities, and a whole group working down in Washington, D.C. to try to get some policies in place that get our country on the right track towards reducing our emissions.
Let's step away from the science right now and talk more about the humanities, because one of the challenges and one of the reasons we're doing this podcast, and as I was show prepping, I was reading about some of your interest in communication. And our second guest on this podcast was a 18-year-old freshman at the University of North Carolina. And we were probing her mind and her experience about, well, what's going on with young people? When you have a climate rally, when you have a climate meeting, are there 400 people or are there 4? Now, I think all of us know that when the older generation does it, the number's closer to 4. And I think she was, learning some stuff about the level of concern, even among her peers. But what do you see? Because I know you still have some professor assignments, some visiting faculty assignments. What do you see with the young people and their willingness to hear the message?
So what I have experienced in recent years is that young audiences are very up to speed on a lot of the problems that their generation is facing. And they're much more interested, or they're less interested in hearing about the problem itself and more interested about hearing solutions. So that gives me a whole bunch of hope, because young people are, I think, much more interested in finding a career, finding a purpose in their lives that addresses these problems, finds solutions in different ways. So in terms of the climate crisis, for example, yes, some of them are becoming scientists, but a whole bunch are doing other things that are related. So becoming engineers to develop new technologies to help combat the climate crisis, or to help people adapt, or to fare better, to be more prepared. People writing computer code, people learning to work with AI, people going into law to help defend the public against, companies that are not doing the right thing, or social work, helping communities to respond or to recover when an extreme weather event happens. I mean, there's just so many ways that young people are figuring out how to find a way to contribute to the solution to not just the climate problem, but a whole host of other problems as well, and even through art and music. So that's what gives me a whole bunch of hope. That's what I'm hearing from young people is, they really want to find a purposeful life to help solve some of these problems. And they're less interested maybe in making a whole bunch of money.
Yeah, that's awesome. Dr. Jennifer Francis of the Woodwell Climate Research Center, thank you so much for joining us. I think we've had this conversation multiple times, at least all four of us, one time or another, that literally any profession, building off what Dr. Francis said, will somehow be involved in climate change. No matter what you go into, there is room for your knowledge in this space. Again, thanks for watching the 3 Degrees podcast and listening. For David Thorson, Channing Dutton, I'm Chris Gloninger. Until next time, enjoy your week.